Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. So we are continuing on with the topic of weather and climate, and this video is focusing on depressions, which in geography are areas of low pressure when it concerns weather conditions. Now, as always, if you check out the description box below, there is a link where you have been given access to some lesson worksheets that go hand in hand with this particular video. So if you want to complete the worksheets alongside watching this video, then the link is in the description box below, and again they are completely free and they're there to help you create a nice set of summary revision notes. So like I said, we're thinking today about depressions, and a depression is what we call an area of low atmospheric pressure, and it is typically produced and creates cloudy, unsettled weather, depressing weather. Okay, that's how I like my students to remember it. Now, these low pressure systems, they often begin in the Atlantic and they move in an easterly direction towards the UK when they affect our weather conditions. And they are responsible for our lovely changeable weather in the UK. So like I said, depressions are created by areas of low pressure. And this is when we have warm air and it is ascending, it's rising, leading to low pressure at the Earth's surface. And because this air is rising, we get evaporation, condensation taking place, and cloud formation taking place, which is why we end up with depressing weather, because we end up with it raining and we have large amounts of precipitation being caused. So to kick us off then, we're going to be thinking about how a depression forms and what weather do they typically bring. So if you're working on the worksheets, you'll see you've got a fill in the blanks opportunity now, where you've got missing words, just like I've put on the screen, and then you've got some paragraphs there where you need to use the missing words to fill them in, and eventually then it will show you how a depression forms. So if I give you a couple of minutes to do that, and then we'll check our answers. Okay, so at this point I'd be asking my students to swap to a different coloured pen to check their answers, so let's go through them. So depressions form over the Atlantic Ocean, that we've already established. And this is when we have warm, moist, tropical air from the south meeting that colder air. It's drier, heavier air from the north, that cold air. And the different air masses, they do not mix very easily due to differences in temperature and air pressure. As the lighter, warmer air moves towards denser, colder air, it's forced to rise over the cold air because that cold air is denser and heavier, whereas that warm air is lighter. This forms what we call a warm front, which we're going to go through in a moment. And as that denser, colder air moves towards the warm air, it's what we call undercuts that warm air, forcing it to rise. This forms what we call a cold front in our depressions, our areas of low pressure. And in both cases, the rising warm air is cooled and some of its water vapour content then condenses, and that produces cloud formation and frontal rainfall, which hopefully you have gone through in my previous video on types of rainfall. Now finally, the cold front then travels faster than the warm front and catching it up to form what we call an occluded front eventually when the depression has passed over. And weather in a depression is therefore unsettled, both in winter and summer. And firstly, as a warm front approaches, we have cloud formation, and then these thicken very quickly and they get larger. And then those winds blow in an anti-clockwise direction for an area of low pressure, and then they slowly increase in strength. So that's the fill in the blanks on how a depression forms. Now, let's then think about an actual diagram to show what a passage of a depression, an area of low pressure, looks like on the ground surface. So again, if you're working on the worksheets, you've got a box that's been provided, and now we're going to add in a nice little diagram here. So we're going to start off with the ground, the Earth's surface, okay? And we know that a depression, an area of low pressure, moves from a west to an easterly direction. So we need to show that movement there on our diagram. Now, when it comes to the passage of a depression, the first stage of a depression is what we call ahead of the warm front. So I've just indicated the warm front here with a red line with semicircles on, and this is what a warm front would look like on a synoptic chart, which is a weather map that meteorologists use to tell us the weather forecast. So the first stage of a depression is when we are in a location ahead of the warm front. So if you are a person standing at the start of a passage of a depression, you are ahead of the warm front. You are in front of it. When you are ahead of the warm front, you experience certain weather conditions. So at this particular stage, the temperature is quite cold. Pressure is starting to fall. The clouds do begin to thicken at this stage and begin to form due to that rising air. And at this stage, we don't have any precipitation taking place. Now, when we get on to stage 2, the passage of depression, when that depression is moving over this same location, we're now moving on to the warm front. So that's why we've got number 2 that's just appeared there on the warm front. And this is where we would have certain types of cloud formation beginning to happen due to condensation taking place to form those clouds. So you've got different cloud names there. You've got your nimbostratus, your altostratus, and your cirrus clouds. And that is just extra geographical knowledge there, okay? Some wider detail. Now at stage 2, on the passage of a depression, we have the temperature beginning to rise. So it turns from it quite cold to rising very slightly, whereas the air pressure does continue to fall in a depression, this low pressure weather system. Cloud cover is relatively low. Those nimbostratus clouds are lower in the atmosphere and they start to become quite thick as well. And we do get at this stage some precipitation in terms of steady rainfall. Now, when we have then moved, again, our depression is passing over a certain location in a west to easterly direction. This is where we would then be in what we call the warm sector. So step 3 in the passage of a depression is the warm sector. And in the warm sector, temperatures are very mild, pressure keeps relatively steady in terms of the air pressure. Cloud cover starts to thin actually and break up because we've had some release of precipitation on the warm front, which we've just obviously covered. So we will have some drizzle in your warm sector, but not too much precipitation taking place there. When we then get to the 4th stage of a depression, we are then talking about being on the cold front. And the cold front on a synoptic chart is indicated by a blue line with triangles on that represent like your icicles. So this is your cold front here. Now, when you're on your cold front, you potentially are going to see clouds, very large clouds beginning to form, and we call these cumulonimbus clouds. These are your rain clouds, okay? So at stage 4 in the passage of a depression, temperature all of a sudden will suddenly drop, so going from mild to dropping quite rapidly, and therefore the pressure then starts to rise very slightly. Like I said before, the cloud cover will also thicken to form those lovely cumulonimbus clouds, these really heavy, dense rain clouds, and that will lead to heavy precipitation, heavy rainfall. And we potentially at this stage as well can experience thunder, lightning, and maybe even some hail as well. Now, when the depression is then continuing to pass over a location in that west to easterly direction, eventually we will then be behind the cold front. And this is where you might have your cumulus clouds being present. And the temperature, unfortunately, remains quite cold, so stays cold after that sudden drop on the cold front. But pressure will start to rise again and continue to rise. The cloud cover will thin, so we'll go from cumulonimbus clouds to cumulus clouds, because obviously that precipitation is starting to be released from the clouds at stage 4. So at stage 5, behind the cold front, we're looking at some light rain showers potentially. So what we should now have is a diagram of the passage of a depression, okay, where you have your 5 different stages of depression with your 5 different weather conditions being experienced there. So on the worksheet, if you're working on the worksheet, there's some additional information in bullet points underneath, okay, that you can obviously read through that also summarise the passage of a depression there. Now, if we then think about what actually these diagrams look like when we're concerning ourselves with synoptic charts. So a synoptic chart is any map that summarises atmospheric conditions. It's basically a weather map, a forecast map that shows us all kinds of features to do with atmospheric conditions: temperature, precipitation, wind speed, wind direction, and usually they cover a wide area. This is what you would see on BBC News, ITV News, when they are sharing the weather forecast for the day and for the week ahead. But the question is, what does a depression actually look like on a synoptic chart? So when we have a depression, you're looking at a synoptic chart very similar to what you see on the screen here. And a depression, as its name implies, is a region of what we call low barometric pressure. And it appears on the synoptic chart as a set of closed, curved isobars. Winds circulate in an anti-clockwise direction in the northern hemisphere, and when you're in the southern hemisphere, so in like Australia for example, they rotate in a clockwise direction, moving again towards that low pressure centre. Now, if we consider the diagram we've just drawn of the passage of a depression and what that actually looks like when we refer to it on a synoptic chart, where I've got my number 1 there, we can see that that is the stage where we are ahead of the warm front. And then stage 2 is when we're on the warm front, so on that line with your semicircles, which this particular synoptic chart you're looking at is in black and white, and that's why the semicircles are so important. But you can also have that line as a red line as well to indicate obviously that it's warm. Now, we've got stage 3 there as well when we're in our warm sector, so we're between our warm and cold front, whereas stage 4 is when we're on our cold front, and that again is indicated with a line with your triangles on, and that line can be blue if we're looking at a coloured synoptic chart to show the passage of a depression. And then stage 5 is where we would be behind the cold front. So a depression has those three elements: a warm front, a warm sector, and a cold front. And like I said, it forms as a result of that warm air mixing and rising above the surrounding cold air. Now that front, just to establish, a front is effectively a boundary between two air masses, so one warm and the other cold. So when you have your warm front, you have warm air on one side and you'll have colder air on the other. So if we were to look at a synoptic chart where we actually have a coloured version, this is taken from BBC News, okay, and what we can see again here is we've got that centre area of low pressure, so we know this is a depression because it has low written in that centre. We have our warm front indicated by that black line with your red semicircles. We've got that cold front with your black line with your blue triangles on as well. And I did refer to an occluded front before. So an occluded front is what you can see on the right hand side just over Europe. And this is where you have your red semicircles and your blue triangles on the same line. That's what we call an occluded front for your wider knowledge there. So what we then have got on the worksheet and also on the screen in front of you, okay, just to relate that diagram that we've drawn to the various weather conditions we can experience, those atmospheric conditions that we get at each stage of a passage of a depression. So what you need to do in geography is you need to understand how the temperature changes and the air pressure changes, cloud cover and precipitation changes throughout the passage of a low pressure system, a depression. So you now need to complete the table using the statements that you're seeing on the screen and also referring back to the previous content we've just covered in the video, as well as on the previous pages on those worksheets provided. And I now need you to fill in as many of those empty boxes as possible to show the different atmospheric conditions of the passage of a depression. So a couple of minutes to do that, and then we'll check them through. Okay, so really quickly checking through that table then with these atmospheric conditions of the passage of a depression, you can see them on the screen now. So it's just a case of making sure that you've got the right ones in the right boxes. I know some of them are already filled in for you because some of them are quite challenging to think about. So, stage 1, quite cold, temperatures needed to be added in, and then again, going through stage 2 and stage 4 and stage 5, those additional boxes now should be filled in. So in geography, you also may need to know the impacts that are caused as a result of these low pressure weather systems, these depressions. And unfortunately, we have quite a lot of negative impacts that they can create due to that unstable, unsettled weather that they bring. So we can have really strong gale force winds, for example, which can unfortunately blow down infrastructure, bridges, for example, signage, and can cause quite a lot of damage if they hit things along the way. It can create flooding due to that high intense precipitation that takes place over potentially a long period of time. It can also lead to, like you see on the screen here, we can have train lines disrupted due to flooding. We can have roads being disrupted as well due to flooding. And that can also lead to cars being damaged and obviously the engine of your car being flooded by floodwater and then your vehicle being damaged as well. We can have what we call storm surges, so really intense, destructive waves that then obviously are being washed up onto the coastline if you're in a coastline region, as well as roads being damaged due to, again, the association with flooding and this intense amount of water that is obviously being released from the atmosphere in the form of precipitation. And that flooding can also cause farmlands and crops to be flooded, destroying food sources and obviously animals being stranded or killed. So farmers will lose their livestock. And it can be quite dangerous to obviously travel during the passage of a depression when we have these gale force winds as well. Now, one positive to come out of the passage of a depression, these low areas of pressure, is the fact that flooding, when it does happen, flooding can lay down a very fine layer of silt on the soil and drop off some nutrients into the soil. So it can increase the nutrients in a soil once the flood waters have been drained, but unfortunately the passage of a depression usually leads to a lot of negative impacts. So again, thank you so much for watching. I really hope you're finding these videos useful. Please do like and subscribe so that I know that you are finding them useful. And thanks very much everyone. Have a lovely day and I'll see you in my next video.